On the morning of August 14th, 1980, Los Angeles was already awake. The sun spilled over quiet residential streets, the kind that usually carried no headlines, no sirens, no tragedy. Inside a modest house in West Los Angeles, a young woman had stepped into what she believed would be a brief, ordinary meeting. She was 20 years old. The world knew her as the newest dream of Hollywood, but in that house, time was about to stop. Just hours earlier, Dorothy Stratten was still a rising star. To the public, she was beauty, promise, and momentum. A Playmate of the Year. A name whispered by producers, photographers, and executives who saw her as the next big thing. She had photo shoots scheduled, scripts waiting, a future that, on paper, seemed almost guaranteed. Yet behind that future stood a past that refused to let go. Why did Dorothy agree to that meeting? Why did she walk back into a space tied to control, fear, and unresolved tension? And why, despite warnings and visible red flags, did no one stop what was coming next? In the final hours of her life, there were no flashing cameras, no crowds, no sense of danger loud enough to break the illusion of normalcy. Just a quiet decision, a locked door, and a moment when escape became impossible. When the silence finally broke, Hollywood would be forced to confront a question it had avoided for too long. How could someone so visible, so celebrated, be so unprotected? This is not just the story of a murder. It is the story of the last moments of a young woman caught between sudden fame and a private nightmare. A story of control disguised as love, of warning signs dismissed, and of a life that ended before it truly began. What really happened in those final hours? And how did a symbol of desire become a symbol of loss almost overnight? This is the story of Dorothy Stratten's last moments. When the news broke, Hollywood froze. At first, the reports were confused, fragmented, almost hesitant. A young actress, a former Playboy playmate, found dead in a house in West Los Angeles. Then came the details. The locked room, the gunshot, the name of the man inside with her, and suddenly, what had seemed like a private tragedy became a cultural shockwave. Dorothy Stratten was not just another name. In the summer of 1980, she represented something very specific to Hollywood's imagination. She was youth, beauty, and possibility condensed into a single figure. Producers spoke about her as the next one. Magazines framed her as innocence wrapped in glamour. To many, she symbolized a new generation of stars who could move effortlessly from modeling into mainstream cinema. And then, without warning, she was gone. Newsrooms scrambled. Television anchors struggled to reconcile the image the public knew with the violence of the facts emerging. Fans reacted with disbelief, not only because of her age, but because of the brutal contrast between who Dorothy was presented as and how her life ended. A woman celebrated for her beauty had died in fear and confinement. A rising star had been extinguished in complete isolation. Almost immediately, the conversation widened. This was no longer just about a murder. It became about power, control, and the dark underside of sudden fame. How could someone so visible vanish into danger without intervention? How could a woman surrounded by managers, photographers, agents, and industry insiders be left so exposed at the most critical moment? As details surfaced, the tone shifted from shock to unease. Friends spoke of concern. Colleagues admitted, quietly, that they had sensed something was wrong. Journalists began digging into Dorothy's personal life, and what they uncovered unsettled, even seasoned reporters. The story behind her final hours was not one of impulse, but of escalation, not a random act, but the end point of a pattern. For Hollywood, Dorothy Stratten's death felt like a mirror held too close. It reflected uncomfortable truths about how young women were protected only when they were profitable, admired only when they were compliant, and left dangerously alone when private threats did not interfere with public image. Within days, vigils appeared. Photographs of Dorothy were reprinted everywhere, now framed by the word tragic. Her smile, once a symbol of arrival, became a symbol of loss. But beneath the mourning lay a deeper question, one that refused to fade. Was this inevitable? To answer that, the story had to move backward, away from the headlines, away from the crime scene, back into the life that led Dorothy Stratten, step by step, toward that locked room. Long before Hollywood learned her name, Dorothy Stratten was a quiet teenager growing up in Vancouver, Canada. Friends from that time remembered her as gentle, shy, and eager to please. She was not someone who demanded attention. She waited for it, and when attention finally came, it arrived faster and heavier than she had ever imagined. Her entry into the modeling world did not begin with ambition. It began with opportunity, and with someone older who claimed to see her potential before anyone else did. Paul Snider was charismatic, persuasive, and deeply insecure. He presented himself as a guide, a protector, a man who could open doors. To Dorothy, still young and uncertain, he seemed like stability, like direction, like safety. What followed was not a partnership, but a transformation. Paul took control of her image, her schedule, and her decisions. He encouraged her to pose. He pushed her toward Playboy. He framed every step as something they were doing together. But even early on, those close to Dorothy noticed the imbalance. He managed her career, negotiated on her behalf, and slowly positioned himself as indispensable. When Dorothy was named Playmate of the Year, everything changed overnight. The attention exploded. Offers poured in. Hollywood noticed, and with that notice came a shift in power that Paul was not prepared to accept. Dorothy was no longer just his discovery. She was becoming her own person, with her own ambitions, her own relationships, and her own future. As her career accelerated, the cracks in her personal life became harder to ignore. Friends described Paul as possessive, increasingly volatile, and deeply threatened by Dorothy's independence. Arguments grew more frequent. Control tightened, and behind closed doors, fear began to replace trust. Hollywood, meanwhile, saw only the surface. Dorothy was cast in films, she attended parties, she smiled for cameras. On screen and in photographs, she embodied confidence and allure. But off-camera, she was navigating a relationship that demanded obedience and punished autonomy. Eventually, Dorothy made a decision that signaled a turning point. She separated from Paul, physically and professionally. She began working with new agents, she explored acting seriously, and for the first time, she talked openly about wanting a life that belonged to her, not to someone else. Yet, separation did not mean freedom. Paul did not disappear. He lingered. He called. He insisted on meetings. He framed his presence as unresolved business, as emotional closure, as something Dorothy owed him. Those around her grew increasingly alarmed. Some urged her to cut contact completely. Others underestimated the risk, believing distance alone would defuse the tension. Dorothy stood at a crossroads that many never see clearly until it is too late. She was young, compassionate, and reluctant to escalate conflict. She wanted peace, not confrontation. And in trying to end things gently, she kept a door open that should have been closed forever. By the summer of 1980, Dorothy Stratten appeared to be stepping into her future. But beneath the progress, the danger had not receded. It had been waiting, and as the days narrowed into hours, the gap between who she was becoming and what she was trying to escape grew dangerously thin. As Dorothy Stratten's career began to move forward, the tension in her private life intensified. What had once been framed as mentorship and partnership revealed itself, more clearly with time, as a system of control. Paul Snider struggled deeply with the shift in power. The industry now wanted Dorothy, not him. Doors opened for her alone, and every step she took away from his influence felt, to him, like abandonment. Friends later recalled how Dorothy's demeanor began to change. She was still kind, still soft-spoken, but there was an underlying anxiety that had not been there before. Phone calls became something she braced herself for. Unexpected appearances unsettled her. There was a growing sense that no matter how far she moved physically or professionally, Paul remained present in the background of her life. Behind the scenes, Paul's behavior escalated. He spoke obsessively about Dorothy. He alternated between pleading and anger. In conversations with others, he framed himself as a victim, a man wronged by the very success he claimed to have created. This narrative became dangerous because it allowed him to justify his fixation as loyalty and his resentment as betrayal. Dorothy, meanwhile, was trying to rebuild a sense of normalcy. She focused on acting classes. She spoke about wanting to be taken seriously, to be more than a magazine image. She surrounded herself with people who encouraged independence and growth, but she also carried guilt. Guilt for leaving someone behind. Guilt for causing pain. Guilt that made her vulnerable to manipulation. Those close to her noticed warning signs. There were conversations about safety, about cutting contact, about how unpredictable Paul had become. But this was a time when such concerns were often minimized, especially when they involved private relationships. There were no formal systems to intervene, no protocols to protect someone in Dorothy's position from a former partner who refused to let go. Hollywood itself played a role in the blindness. The industry thrived on reinvention, but rarely paused to ask what that reinvention cost emotionally. Dorothy was praised for her beauty, her potential, her upward trajectory. Few asked how she was coping. Fewer still took seriously the idea that she might be in real danger. Paul's isolation deepened as Dorothy's world expanded. He was cut off from the lifestyle he had briefly tasted. Financial strain, humiliation, and jealousy fed into a growing sense of desperation. To those around him, he appeared unstable, fixated, and increasingly detached from reality. Yet no decisive action was taken to separate him from Dorothy's life completely. This period was not marked by a single explosive incident, but by a slow tightening of pressure, a series of ignored instincts, a collection of moments where intervention might have changed the outcome. Dorothy was moving forward, but the shadow behind her was growing darker. By the time the calendar turned toward mid-August, 1980, the situation had reached a breaking point. The emotional distance between Dorothy and Paul was absolute, but the physical distance was not. And in that narrowing space between separation and finality, the path toward tragedy was already set. In the weeks leading up to her death, Dorothy Stratten's life existed in two parallel realities. In public, everything appeared to be aligning. She had begun to distance herself from the image that had first made her famous and was actively pursuing acting as a serious craft. She spent time on set, attended classes, and spoke with cautious optimism about a future defined by choice rather than circumstance. To those who met her briefly, she seemed lighter, more confident, almost relieved. Privately, however, the tension had not disappeared. It had merely gone quiet. Paul Snyder continued to reach out, refusing to accept the finality of their separation. He framed his messages as practical matters, unresolved paperwork, lingering business concerns, but beneath those justifications was an emotional urgency that made those around Dorothy uneasy. He wanted to see her. He wanted to talk. He insisted that there were things only she could help him understand. Dorothy hesitated. Friends would later say that she appeared torn between fear and compassion. She did not want to provoke him. She did not want to escalate a conflict that she hoped might fade with time. Like many people in similar situations, she believed that one calm conversation could bring closure. That if she explained herself clearly, if she met him face to face, the tension might finally dissolve. This belief would prove tragically wrong. In the days before August 14th, there were subtle signs that something was off. Dorothy became more reserved. She shared fewer details about her schedule. She reassured those close to her that everything was under control, even as her body language suggested otherwise. The instinct to minimize danger, to avoid alarming others, kept her isolated at the very moment when she needed protection the most. The meeting was arranged quickly. It was meant to be brief. Perhaps believing that her presence alone could diffuse the situation. The house was quiet. The time chosen was unremarkable. There was no sense of ceremony, no dramatic lead-up, just the ordinary texture of a weekday morning. No one was informed of exactly what time she would be there. No one waited nearby. No one insisted on accompanying her. On the morning of the meeting, Dorothy followed her routine. She dressed simply. She left with the expectation that she would return soon. There were no known final messages hinting at fear, no explicit goodbyes. What exists instead is the silence of assumption. The assumption that this was safe. The assumption that danger announces itself loudly. As Dorothy arrived at the house, she crossed a threshold that marked the final separation between intention and outcome. Inside, the dynamic that had defined her past relationship was about to reassert itself in its most extreme form. Control, resentment, and obsession converged in a space with no witnesses. The hours that followed would never be fully heard, fully reconstructed, or fully understood. But what is clear is that the belief in closure, the hope that kindness could neutralize danger, carried Dorothy Stratten into the last moments of her life. The final day of Dorothy Stratten's life unfolded without drama on the surface. There were no emergency calls, no public confrontations, no visible signs that something catastrophic was about to happen. By all available accounts, the morning began quietly, the way so many mornings do before history intervenes. Dorothy arrived at the house in West Los Angeles shortly after midday. It was a familiar place, tied to memories she was trying to move beyond. According to reports, she entered willingly, expecting a conversation that would bring resolution. What she could not see was the emotional state waiting for her inside. Paul Snyder had spent days, perhaps weeks, spiraling inward, isolated, resentful, and convinced that Dorothy's independence was a personal betrayal. He was no longer operating within the boundaries of reason. Inside the house, the atmosphere was closed, private, sealed off from the outside world. The door was locked, curtains drawn. Whatever words were exchanged between them remain unknown. There are no recordings, no witnesses, only the outcome. What investigators later determined is that, at some point during that meeting, Paul Snyder shot Dorothy Stratten at close range. Afterward, alone in the same room, he took his own life. The sequence of events unfolded quickly, but the forces that drove it had been building for years. Hours passed before anyone became alarmed. Dorothy did not return. Calls went unanswered. Concern turned into urgency. When authorities were finally alerted and arrived at the house, they discovered the locked room and forced entry. Inside, they found the bodies. The silence that followed was heavy, absolute. The official conclusion was clear and immediate. A murder followed by suicide. The facts, stark and final, left little room for procedural doubt, yet clarity did not bring comfort. The brutality of the scene contrasted violently with the image the world had of Dorothy just days earlier. A young woman on the brink of opportunity, gone in a space meant for conversation. There were no last words preserved for history, no final letter, no public farewell. What remains instead is the unbearable weight of what might have been said, what might have changed if the door had never closed. For those who loved her, the knowledge that Dorothy's final moments were spent in fear and confinement was devastating. For Hollywood, the realization came with shame. The industry had celebrated her ascent but had not recognized the danger that followed her off camera. The clock stopped for Dorothy Stratten that afternoon. But for everyone else, time rushed forward into shock, questions, and an aching sense of responsibility. And as the world absorbed the news, a new chapter began. One defined not by speculation about what happened inside that room, but by the uncomfortable examination of how it was allowed to happen at all. The investigation that followed Dorothy Stratten's death moved swiftly, but its emotional impact lingered far longer than the official process. From a legal standpoint, the case appeared straightforward. Authorities confirmed what the scene had already suggested: a murder followed by suicide. The evidence inside the locked room left little ambiguity about the sequence of events. There would be no trial, no courtroom confrontation, no public reckoning in the traditional sense. And yet, the absence of legal uncertainty did not quiet the questions. In the days after the discovery, journalists descended on every corner of Dorothy's life. Interviews were conducted with friends, co-workers, neighbors, and anyone who had crossed paths with her in the final months. What emerged was not a mystery of how she died, but a deeper, more troubling mystery of how the danger had been allowed to escalate unnoticed, unchecked, and unaddressed. Those who knew Dorothy began speaking openly about Paul Snyder's behavior. Stories surfaced of possessiveness, fixation, and emotional volatility. Some described explicit warnings they had voiced, concerns they had shared privately but never formally reported. In retrospect, the pattern appeared unmistakable: control, isolation, escalation. But hindsight, as always, arrived too late. The media coverage shifted tone. Early headlines focused on the sensational aspects of the case: the Playboy connection, the violence, the shock. But as reporting deepened, a more uncomfortable narrative took shape. Dorothy was no longer portrayed solely as a victim of a single act, but as a young woman navigating a system that offered fame without protection, exposure without safety. Industry insiders began reflecting on their own roles. Questions surfaced about responsibility. Should studios have intervened? Should managers have insisted on safeguards? Was Dorothy's vulnerability overlooked because her public image suggested confidence and control? These questions had no easy answers, but they demanded to be asked. For many women in Hollywood, Dorothy Stratten's death resonated as a warning. It exposed how private threats could exist alongside public success, and how quickly admiration could turn into invisibility when danger did not disrupt production schedules or profit margins. Advocacy groups pointed to the case as a stark example of intimate partner violence long before the term entered mainstream conversation. There were no competing theories about what physically occurred in that room, but there were competing interpretations of meaning. To some, it was a personal tragedy driven by one man's obsession. To others, it was a systemic failure, a moment when an industry failed to recognize that talent does not shield someone from harm. As the headlines faded, the questions remained. Not about who pulled the trigger, but about who could have stepped in earlier, who could have listened more closely, who could have taken the warning signs seriously enough to interrupt the trajectory. Dorothy Stratten's death closed a chapter with devastating finality, but the conversation it ignited would continue, quietly reshaping how people talked about power, control, and vulnerability in the shadow of fame. In the years since Dorothy Stratten's death, her image has remained frozen in time. The photographs still circulate, the smile still looks effortless, the promise still feels close enough to touch. But the meaning attached to her life has changed, shaped not only by what she achieved, but by how abruptly and violently it ended. Dorothy did not leave behind a vast body of work or a long list of awards. What she left instead was a question that refuses to fade. How many warning signs can exist before responsibility becomes unavoidable? Her story forced Hollywood, and the public watching it, to confront the uncomfortable truth that beauty and opportunity do not equal safety. That visibility does not guarantee protection, and that silence even when born from kindness or fear, can be deadly. For many, Dorothy became a symbol not of scandal, but of vulnerability. Her death helped expose patterns that had long been normalized and ignored. Control disguised as care, obsession mistaken for devotion, power imbalances excused as personal affairs. Long before society had the language to describe these dynamics clearly, her life illustrated them with heartbreaking clarity. There is no way to rewrite Dorothy Stratten's final hours, no version of the story where a different choice guarantees a different ending. But her legacy lives in the awareness her story continues to create, in the conversations about protection, boundaries, and the cost of dismissing private danger because public success looks convincing. In remembering Dorothy, it is not enough to recall who she was at her peak. We must also remember who she was at her most human. A young woman trying to move forward, trying to be kind, trying to end something without violence. Her final moments remind us that the most dangerous threats often arrive quietly, wearing the face of familiarity. Dorothy Stratten's life ended in a locked room, but the meaning of her story did not end there. It continues in every moment when someone recognizes a warning sign, takes a concern seriously, or chooses intervention over indifference. And in that way, even as time moves forward, her final hours continue to speak.